you all so very much for being here tonight. We are incredibly excited about the program. I'm Mary Elizabeth Harper, for those of you who don't know me. I direct Gulf Quest, and this evening would not be possible without the partnership with the Mobile Public Library, and two of those players are here, including Lizzie, who's going to speak in just a minute. I had this long list of housekeeping notes where books are going to be for you to sign and so forth, but we've already covered, you've already discovered all of that. So what I'm going to say is that in case people don't know, on April 6th, next Thursday at 6 o'clock at the Robert Hope Community Center in Africatown, there will be a meeting about a planning session for the design of the Africatown Welcome Center, in case people want to do that. And without further ado, I would very much like to introduce Lizzie Elizabeth Therisburn from the Mobile Local History and Genealogy Library.
So this is going to be just an introduction to local history and genealogy. To get the full run of it, you'll have to come visit us. So this is us from Government Street side. If you come to visit, you'll need to walk around to the back of the building, but our mission is to collect, preserve, and provide access to the history of Mobile and the greater Gulf Coast region. We're located right beside the Ben May Main Library downtown, and we're open Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5. Okay, the way the books are arranged in our library is a little bit different than what you might see at the regular public library. Our books are arranged partly by the Dewey number, and partly they're arranged for geographical serendipity. For example, if you know that you have an ancestor from Hale County, Alabama, you would go to the Hale County section where the county record indexes are arranged. They're grouped together alphabetically by the state, and then within that section, they're grouped together alphabetically by the county. We have Mobile City directories going back to 1837. We have family histories. Some are published works, and some are research that somebody put together and donated to make future research easier for people. We have a military section with rosters, pension indexes. The sections that are arranged by the Dewey number, the types of books you might find in them are a little bit different. We do have a fiction section, but they are mostly local authors or people who did research about Mobile to set their novel within that time frame. None of the items in our library can check out, but access is our main mission, so we're always happy to make scans or copies. But the idea is for the book to always be there, to always be available for everybody, forever. We do have a yearbook section, mostly Mobile high schools. We also have colleges, some for Mississippi and the surrounding areas. A quick note about the city directories, if you're using them for research. Going back to, they were separated by race. So if you are researching your ancestor, it's important to pay attention. Sometimes they'll be notified with an asterisk, or they'll have a C beside it, or CRE for Creole. In the 1909 one, they had it completely separated. They had the white population in the front and the mixed population in the back. Just little things you have to pay attention to so you know for sure you're looking at the right person. This is one of our most widely used resources, is the newspapers on microfilm. We have the Mobile Register in its various incarnations going back to 1819. The Mobile Press, which was the afternoon edition from 1930 to 1997. A couple of African American newspapers we have, the Nationalist, though regrettably only a few years. The Mobile Beacon was an African American newspaper. We have it on microfilm from the 60s to 94, and then we also have some physical copies in archival boxes for the late 90s. Okay, a quick note about the microfilm. You do need to know when something happened in order to effectively research it. Otherwise, you're going to be scrolling through months and months of microfilm, and it's very time-consuming and tedious. Some of the records you might find in the newspaper are obituaries. They are a wealth of information for researching your ancestry. The good ones will have the place of birth of the person who died. Sometimes it'll have the date of death, surviving family members, like survived by his wife, and then it'll also say where they're from. Something to be mindful of is that the obituaries were likewise segregated in the newspaper. So they have a regular mortuary section and a Negro mortuary section, and even that you wouldn't see regularly in the newspaper until around 1942, and then they're going to keep that section segregated until I think around May of 1968. So the newspaper is not being searchable for a large period of time. One of our efforts is we index the obituaries in the Mobile Register. We have them indexed we're on 1950 right now, so from the 50s up into the 90s. If you know the name of the person, we can find the day and the page number that their obituary was posted on. Starting in January of 1885, the Mobile Register started publishing a vital statistics column. So it will have the births, marriages, and deaths for that week that were submitted to the health department. And those are likewise separated according to white citizens versus colored citizens. And one thing you have to know is that it's just for the week, 1 week with a bunch of names. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the date when the event occurred. It could have happened from any surrounding weeks of the day that you see it in the paper. This is our new favorite machine. It's the ScanPro 3500. From here, you can view the microfilm and you can edit the image to make it better. You can adjust the contrast and the brightness. You can zoom in. You can download or scan your file as multiple file formats and email it to yourself. So it is the absolute best way to view microfilm so far. Since the newspapers aren't searchable for Mobile for a very large period of time, one way you can search the papers is our vertical file collection. We have over 3,000 clipping files for people, places, events, cemeteries, schools, all of that for Mobile and Alabama as well. And the index is available on the library website. So they're grouped by category, or you can just do a Control F and search for a certain name or a certain topic. And fortunately, there are some newspaper databases through which the paper is searchable. Newsbank is our favorite so far. It has sporadic 19th century coverage from 1858 to 1870. You can't really see it, but it has a very misleading date range on here. It says 1858 through 1992, but there is a complete gap in coverage from 1870 to 1970. So absolutely no digitized content there. And from about 1993 to 2018, it is strictly text-based. That is, it's not newspaper format. It won't include the pictures. It won't include advertisements. Some of the obituaries aren't included because they're considered advertisements of the funeral home. This is an example of image-based versus text-based. So you can see here, now you can't. All right, so picture, newspaper format, as opposed to just the words pretty much printed on a Word document. So I'm sure most of you know the Mobile Register recently stopped publishing and has gone to digital content. Through Newsbank, you can still access the AL.com articles that would show up in the lead, but it is unfortunately strictly text-based at this point, so no images. It'll look pretty much just like that, but the information is there. We can't have it all. This is one of our newer databases we subscribe to, Newspaper Archive. We sent them our microfilm for the daily item. It ran from 1899 to 1939, and they digitized it, and it's available and searchable. You can access both of these databases from home with your Mobile Public Library card. There are a few extra steps for Newspaper Archive. Whether you're in the library or not, it's going to ask for your library card number, and then you'll create an account with your email address and log in. So it's a little bit less easy to access, but that is a 40-year range of Mobile newspapers that's searchable that you can't find anywhere else, or that before now wasn't available. Of course, Ancestry.com is one of our most popular databases, for my location at least. But it's free. You can access it on any Mobile Public Library computer. The only difference with the library edition is that you cannot create your own family tree. You can view others as long as they've been marked that way, but you can't create yours, and certain collections are blocked. FamilySearch.org is a completely free genealogical database that you can access from anywhere. You create an account with your phone number or email address. And we are also an affiliate library with Family Search, and that gives us access to millions of additional records that you can't access from home. There's some of them listed here. The one that we use the most frequently is Alabama deaths from 1908 to 1974, and those are the actual death certificate. On Ancestry or on Family Search from home, you can still access the summary of it, but you can't see the actual document unless you're in an affiliate library like we are. So this is an example of a death certificate. The type of information you can find on it is awesome. You can get the person's birth date and place of birth. It'll list the father's name, the mother and her maiden name, cause of death, burial date, place of burial, the funeral home. One caveat is that the information on it is only as good as what the informant knew. So sometimes on these you might see DK for don't know for a lot of the information, or even worse, you might see the information that's just wrong. I've seen parents listed on a death certificate that in the obituary were listed as grandparents. So there's no such thing as a perfect record, and you always have to try to find another source to back up what you think is true. Other death records we have access to, we have microfiche with Mobile death certificates from 1876 to 1908. And we also have the Mobile Sexton's reports that go back to 1848. The type of information you find on that can vary. Some of them will be a death record. Some might just be a burial permit or a receipt showing that you purchased the plot. But it's always worth looking through. Do you want to make a quick mention of another free genealogical database? Findagrave.com. It originally started, the person had a hobby of wanting to visit famous people's graves, and he wanted to share his hobby with the world. So, well, it started off that way, but now it's a fantastic resource for genealogy. Mostly what it was originally intended for was like a virtual cemetery experience where you would find a picture of the headstone perhaps. Nowadays, what many of us are using it for is to create memorials that link family members together. Like this one has the death certificate, it's linked to memorials for family members, and depending on the person who creates it, you can get a wealth of information. You just have to be aware that the memorials are created by people. So people are fallible, much like everything in this world. Always check your sources. Don't take anyone else's work at face value without checking it yourself. This is one of our collections that's been a lot of help for people doing research on Africatown or just African Americans in Mobile. It's the Mobile Tricentennial Video Oral History Project, and it was spearheaded by Dr. Kern Jackson, who's somewhere in this room. It was a collaboration with the National African American Archives and Museum and the History Museum of Mobile, and its mission was to collect and preserve the rich information about traditionally African American neighborhoods in Mobile. And they're oral history interviews, but they're video recorded. They're not just audio. Like, you can watch the person. And also, they are fully transcribed, which makes it so easy. Otherwise, oral history is awesome, but sometimes it can be very time-consuming. But if you have a transcribed interview, you can search for certain keywords, or you can read an hour-long interview faster than you can watch it. We have the preservation copies, or VHSs were placed with us kind of as a preservation means, and then we used our Magnavox machine to convert them to DVD and then MP4 for access copies. On the NPL Digital Archives, we have some clippings of them that are available, and also the full list. So it's at least 80 names, I believe. This is another oral history project. It was conducted by the library in the 70s. I found it in the vault one day. It's 159 reel-to-reels that we had no way to play or listen to. So we sent them off, and the company was called Current Pixel. They converted them to MP3 and WAV files. The general idea was a little bit mixed. The people doing it wanted to cover social life in Mobile, the sounds of life in Mobile. Some slight criticism on this has been that the scope was not very focused. Some of them are like the recordings, the sounds of a Mardi Gras parade or a Bob Dylan concert that may or may not have even been legal. But so they do have their weaknesses. They were created at a time when, I think they call it what, oral history fever was gripping the nation. Everybody wanted to do a project like this, but not everybody was as well suited as Dr. Jackson for it. But it's still a wealth of information. And it's not transcribed, so you can't, but we do have index cards, and they will break it down by topic as to what the people were mentioning. Like Frederick Richardson, his interview has a lot to do with the neighborhood organized workers and their downfall, apparently. Alexander Housey, you can look for specific things to look for, like Black culture in Mobile, Plateau in the 1900s. We have Clara Eva Allen Jones, was known as Mama Ava, and she was a direct descendant of Polly Allen. He was her father, and came over directly on the Clotilda. And one day, maybe we dream of having this fully transcribed and available online. We're just not there yet. Bear with us. And so the MPL Digital Archives, you can access it from anywhere. You don't need a library card or anything like that. There's the website there, digital.mobilepubliclibrary.org. There's a link to it on the library website. We have various collections available on it, some clippings from the oral history interviews, 19th century Mardi Gras invitations. Right when we shut down for COVID, me and Valerie went through the microfilm and gathered all of the 1918 articles about the influenza pandemic in Mobile. So that's, if you want to see whether we changed the way we respond to pandemics and panic. We don't, by the way. It was very similar. So one of our very pertinent and popular collections is the Clotilda collection, of course. It is a mix of articles from the Africatown history, Africatown descendants vertical files, also the Clotilda vertical files. And we also have some 19th century original documents that were, the story is they were donated to us by either one of the mayors or one of the Fosters, but I haven't found a note of provenance to back that up yet. But one of the things that's been really useful for researchers in Mobile is Captain Foster's journal that he wrote. He wrote it in 1890, long after the fact, but he goes over the details of what he did. The general story is that he was getting jealous about all of the acclaim that Timothy Mayer was getting from bragging about his endeavor, so he wrote this to try to say, it was me, I did it. So With all that being said, this is us. This is our contact information. Email, phone number. We do provide remote reference services, so if you have any questions, you're always welcome to contact us. Or if you just want to come in and learn how to get started on your research, we're always happy to help. And without any further delay, man of the hour, Mr. Tabor.
Thanks, Lizzie. Yeah, I spent so many hours in the local history and genealogy branch. The book would not have been possible without those resources. I had some thrilling moments, thrilling discoveries there. I remember at one point in the middle of the lockdowns, I was reading for like the 100th time a newspaper clip that was on the screen just a second ago. The headline was "Legacy of a Peculiar Institution," and it's about Mama Eva, Clara Eva Ellen Jones. And I realized that, so it has all this information about her life, but I noticed that it said somewhere, almost like a footnote, it said this came from an interview that was done by the library. And so I emailed Valerie and Lizzie and said, hey, does this still exist by any chance? And Lizzie said, well, you're in luck. It was in the vault, capital V. It was on reel to reel, but it just got digitized. And it was quite a treasure. She was, I think, the last daughter of Polly Allen, and he continued having kids pretty late in life. So as of the 1980s, we still had I think a couple of descendants who were in a way sort of the second generation of the Clotilda survivors, and so they had these memories that had been preserved, sort of buried but preserved in the 70s and early 80s of how the shipmates lived. And she talks about her father's cooking methods, the way that he would make food at home, and she talks about she gives some clues about why the language was not really preserved. People always ask me, is this anything like the Gullah Geechee in South Carolina? Like, did the people in Africatown preserve the language? And in her interviews, she sort of speaks to how it is that did not happen. There was a lot of stigma for kids in her generation, as they were not eager to associate themselves with the African ways of their parents. At any rate, I'm going to read a little bit and show you some photos that we're probably not used to seeing. This is fun for me because I've done presentations in New York, New Orleans, and I have to explain the whole Clotilda story because I assume that people go in not knowing it, but here I'm going to assume the opposite. I'm going to assume you know it, and so I'll be able to show some different dimensions of the history than you usually see. But the bulk of the presentation will be, I'll be joined by Joe Womack and Dr. Kern Jackson. So this little part at the beginning was just an introduction. So I want to talk about John Smith, who was the mayor of Pritchard in the 1980s, who, in a lot of ways, the push that's happening right now to recognize Africatown and transform it into a heritage tourism destination sort of has a precedent in the 80s. There was a similar effort back then, and I think it's largely forgotten. Of course, there are still people around who know all about it and remember it, but it's not talked about very much. And I think that if things had gone better for them in the 80s, then the community might look a little bit different now than it does. All right. On a rainy Thursday morning in April 1983, Smith went into the Dirksen office building in Washington, D.C. He was there to testify before a Senate subcommittee regarding Howell Heflin's bill. This was a bill to create an Africatown national park that Howell Heflin had filed. The timing was somewhat unfortunate. The network of national parks had been rapidly expanded during Jimmy Carter's presidency, but that trend had come to a halt the moment Ronald Reagan took office. James Watt, the Interior Secretary who oversaw the National Park Service, was the most controversial figure in Reagan's cabinet. Before his appointment, Watt had been one of the country's leading opponents of the conservation movement. Once in office, he had called for a moratorium on park expansion in order to save money, and there were reports that he'd prepared a hit list of urban parks that he wanted deauthorized, though he denied this. The Reagan administration also tried to slash $50 million from the department's budget and hike the fees for park visitors, saying it wanted to make the parks less competitive with the private recreation industry. Knowing what they were up against, Heflin and his office had kept the bill modest. They estimated development costs would total $8 million, which would be $21 million now. But Smith was promising to raise all of this money from private investors. The federal government was only being asked to give the park a designation, a process expected to cost around $300,000. It was reasonable to think the Park Service might agree to a compromise. The hearing was before a division of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. The 8 senators had other business that morning, including a bill establishing a new Harry S. Truman National Historic Site in Missouri, which the Park Service strongly endorsed. When it was time to take up the Africatown bill, Heflin and Smith were summoned to the desk in the center of the room. The committee members sat before them at a table that curved in a broad semicircle. Heflin addressed them first. "Good morning," he drawled. Heflin was tall and burly with broad shoulders and an immense square jaw. He'd entered electoral politics late in life after a stint as the Chief Justice of Alabama's Supreme Court. Senate colleagues addressed him as judge. He leaned into the microphone and read from his prepared remarks. "Africatown, USA, Alabama is an area of exceptional significance in local, national, and international history and culture," he said. "The neighborhood was, quote, a living reflection of the nation's heritage, and therefore should be protected and enhanced for ourselves and our posterity." Heflin understood the Park Service had objections, but he saw no reason those should derail the whole project. "We do not care whether we will end up calling it a park or a district or a landmark, site, or zone." He proposed a conference between his office, John Smith, Henry Williams, and the park officials, where they could work out the details. Smith's turn was next. He told the 8 senators about the research he and the graduate students — he was a PhD student at University of Wisconsin before he became the mayor — the work they had done, which yielded a stack of documentation on Africatown's history, including some of Zora Neale Hurston's work. The Africatown landscape, he argued, must be protected as an invaluable public resource. But besides historic preservation, he offered another reason to back the project: to spur economic development. At this point, his language became overtly Reaganite. "Mr. Chairman, if Congress is truly serious about municipal government assuming greater responsibility for establishing self-reliant economies, reducing the incidence of poverty, welfare, and unemployment, then this small effort in the city of Pritchard will be recognized and supported." Mary Lou Greer, the Park Service deputy director, followed him at the microphone. Greer was a political appointee selected by Watt in 1981. She had no prior experience in public service, but had worked for years on Republican campaigns in Texas. "We would strongly recommend against enactment of this bill," she said. She gave 2 reasons. First, the government had not identified any site, buildings, or objects of national historical significance in the area. Granted, this was only because it hadn't tried. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "while the event of the last landing is significant, the site where it occurred has been little studied." Her second objection was that Africatown lacked historical integrity, or in other words, that it didn't feel like a historical place. It was a modern community impacted by modern residential and industrial construction, including many rail lines. It's a quote. "This assessment sounds harsh, but internal records from the Park Service show that non-political staffers who advised Greer about what to say were sympathetic to Africatown's situation. The landing of the Clotilda," one historian wrote to a colleague that February, "was clearly an event of great importance. American blacks had no Ellis Island," he wrote, "and places like Africatown were the closest counterpart. But in the scanty applications they had seen so far, there wasn't much evidence that Africatown still had physical sites intact that would meet the threshold for a federal designation." I will point out that something I've discovered in my research is that houses built by the shipmates were still intact as of the early 80s. They were on Bay Bridge Road in that corridor that was wiped out to expand the highway for the transportation of industrial hazardous cargo. Descendants tried to stop the state from destroying them. I have these letters where the state highway engineer says, "Look, if you want to move them yourself at your own expense, that's fine, but you got to get them out of the way by a certain date because the clock is ticking. You know, we can't delay on this. So at any rate, there were historic buildings there. The government just wasn't looking. So they said there wasn't much evidence that Africatown still had physical sites intact that would meet the threshold for a federal designation. Their comments reflected a more deeply rooted problem. The Park Service criteria, with their focus on architecture, were inherently weighted against historic black communities like Africatown. The Clotilda shipmates, like so many other freed people throughout the South, had lacked the resources to fashion robust buildings that would last for many generations, even if, as of the early 1980s, at least a few of their homes still stood. And in fact, in their jobs at sawmills and shingle mills, the shipmates had not only helped the mayors and other white families to build up their wealth, they had also produced the very building materials that had been used for white people's homes and businesses. By the 1980s, for a historic black community to be surrounded by heavy industry, as Africatown was not unusual either. The end result was that while the Park Service's rules seemed neutral, in practice they tended to reinforce the historical inequities between black communities and white ones. As the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation had pointed out in the 1970s, by the way, this organization, Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation, was really interesting. They were responsible for getting scores of black history sites added to the National Register. In the 70s, I wrote a piece about them for the Washington Post a month or two ago. The Park Service had not always been consistent about these criteria either. The site of the first Pacific Coast Cannery in California, a restaurant where the first commercial telephone exchange had once stood in New Haven, Connecticut, and the former site of Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond, Massachusetts, were all National Historic Landmarks, meaning the sites of these former structures were not only recognized as historic, but were protected from further development. And the approximate site where the first Roman Catholic Mass had been conducted in the northern Rocky Mountains was on the National Register of Historic Places. What the Park Service staffers had suggested before this hearing in 1983 was further study of Africatown. No one from the agency had ever made an official visit. Greer went on to voice this recommendation. The department would be willing to investigate further, she said, if funds were made available. She estimated a proper survey would cost $50,000 and would take 3 months. Judging from the subcommittee chairman's response, it sounded like the legislators were willing to take up the suggestion. Smith must have left the hearing that day feeling buoyant. This was the best outcome he could have reasonably hoped for. But in the long run, the study was apparently never done. As the months passed, it became clear the bill would not get traction. Available records do not convey what happened. James Watt or his lieutenants may have been responsible, given their knee-jerk resistance to adding more parks, or perhaps there was some other cause. The Park Service, as it would turn out, was not the only institution skeptical of the project. The following chapter is called "A Threat to Business." That's a quotation. It comes from an internal newsletter that Scott Paper put out, and they had a big headline that said, "Africatown, a threat to business," saying if we make this a historic preservation area, then you know, next thing we know they're going to be shutting down our factory. So we got to fight this tooth and nail. So I've always wondered if Scott Paper had something to do with the federal government not acting on this bill, but it's not. There are no records of that. Yeah, I'm just going to show you some photos from the neighborhood's history. This is Udley Hubbard, who ran a grocery store, one of the principal grocery stores in the neighborhood for years. This is Mr. Hubbard as a young man. His daughters dug this photo up for me. I think it's quite a treasure. I believe Joe Womack used to work there. This is the schoolyard of the Mobile County Training School. This is from the collection at the University of South Alabama. A couple more photos of the school in its early days. I think these were taken in the 20s or 30s. I believe it was the Isaiah Whitley era before Benjamin Baker became the principal. And this is a map that Albert Murray, who's a writer who grew up in Africatown, I think my understanding is that he made a handwritten version of this, or made a drawing himself, and then when the Library of America reissued his books, a few years ago, they had a professional artist make a sort of a cleaner, more polished version, which they were kind enough to share with me. Dr. Jackson and I have just finished an essay about Albert Murray and his childhood in Africatown. It's going to be published soon in the Paris Review, and so planning to use this map. This photo is small, unfortunately, but this is a young Murray. This is an older Murray. He was born in Magazine Point in, I want to say it was 1918 or 1919, and he was quite a wonderkind. He was like the pride and joy of the Mobile County Trading School. He received a scholarship to Tuskegee, and he became close friends with Ralph Ellison, and he didn't really start his writing career until he was in his 40s, I think, and by then he was living in Harlem, sort of cat-a-corner from the Schomburg Center, but from there he wrote several novels about Magazine Point, which he called Gasoline Point in the books, because there was a refinery there, and a memoir called South to a Very Old Place, where Willie Morris, the editor of Harper's, sent him down to go visit his old stomping grounds. Yep, here's Murray again. This is Richard Holt, who I believe was the principal of the school when Joe was a student. This is one of the earliest photos we have of the original bust of Cudjoe Lewis. It was dedicated in 1959. Henry Williams designed it. I've got some photos of Mr. Williams here as well. He designed it. Somebody else cast it in bronze, I guess, and he thought that it was the 100th anniversary of when the ship came. For a long time, most people thought that it had arrived in 1859. We now know it was 1860. This is him with his bust. This is from the 1970s. John Smith, as I mentioned, had been a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin before he became the mayor of Pritchard, and he brought an anthropology professor down, and this professor is still alive, and he was kind enough to share some photos that he snapped back on his trip. This is Henry Williams' workshop, and he welded it. He bought all these barrels, these oil drums, for like 10 cents a piece from a factory that was not far from his shop on Chin Street in Magazine Point, and he welded them together. I always think that he was sort of an outsider artist in the best sense. And this is him. This is an aerial shot of Scott Paper taken in the 1980s. They have quite a few of these in the collection at South, and I like the photo just because it gives a sense of the scale of this factory. It's like as big as a college campus or something. It's just, it's I just find it staggering. And this was on the border of, a residential zone where people lived and raised their families. This is John Smith. As a young man, I think this was right about the time that he spoke to the Senate. His wife, Dr. Barbara Wheat, dug this out of storage for me. She dug this one out as well. When he was putting on these Africatown folk festivals in the 1980s, he had diplomats visit from all over West Africa. And so this is him with a few of those. And then finally, I have a few photos here from the Mobile. I apologize. Sometimes I get all of these institutions, the names blur together in my head. Historic Development Commission or Corporation. These are mostly photos of homes that were along that corridor on Bay Bridge Road. before the highway was expanded in the 80s. This researcher, Betsy Gould, went through and took lots of photos and made extensive notes and tried to date the houses. And in a lot of cases, she couldn't because there was no paperwork. And in some cases, they had been built onto, and they didn't necessarily look like homes built in the 1870s or 80s any longer. But the families knew, when they had been constructed. But these ones do look older than some of the others. I love this photo. But some of them were more modern. And then the last couple are photos of 500 Bay Bridge Road, which I know you can't tell from looking at it, but this is the house that Cudjoe built. The family says that they just built onto it, but the core of it was the house that he constructed that we have photos of from the 20s. And I believe them. I don't, like, they would know. Gary Lumbers, Cudjoe's great-great-grandson, thinks that it's his, he feels terrible about this. He thinks it's his fault that the houses were destroyed. He says that he stopped paying taxes on it when he inherited it. But I think that it was probably destroyed to build the highway, and there are no records. They didn't keep meticulous records showing what they destroyed in 1985, but it's given its location, it seems likely to me that it was just part of that demolition effort. And of course, this is what's there now. This photo was taken by Mike Kittrell. I think it's a great shot that really captures a lot. The houses would have been on the left-hand side. But I wanted to end with a more peaceful, more tranquil scene. This is Hog Bayou, and the first time I visited Africatown, Joe took me out to Hog Bayou, where the power plant is, and it's a industrial zone. But he brought me out to the edge of the water and had me look down, and I gasped when I saw this. It's such a stark contrast to like what the power plant right next door looks like, and Africatown still has these elements of wildness intact. I think Descendant, the film, does an excellent job of showing that, and still has this natural beauty kind of there just beyond the border of the industry. And this photo is also by Mike Kittrell, and I think it's lovely.
And while they're getting settled, so I had a question for some of y'all. My name's Kern. I teach out to the University of South Alabama. I love seeing those pictures of the Beninian contingent showing up at Union Baptist Church in the 1980s, because my friend and predecessor, Dr. Gene McIver, who just passed in December, was very active in getting those folks here for John Smith and for housing them on Brookley when it was part of the USA campus. So I sort of like the undertones, not just of the lumber of the USA Foundation going through Africatown and being part of that, but in terms of the advocacy. And speaking of advocacy, just one question to a couple of y'all in the audience, before you don't mind, Nick and Joe and Joycelyn. And so, let's see. Hey, Bobby. You just went down? Hey, Bobby and Pat, where y'all at? Bobby and Pat are descendants. Bobby and Pat, y'all live down the bay, right? Y'all have sidewalks in front of your house? No. Okay.
The street was not even paved when we moved there in 1956.
Mm-hmm.
It was paved right after.
Hey, Phil, you live out there in Skyline, right? Y'all got sidewalks? Okay. Dave, you way out there. Got sidewalks?
Yeah.
Vicky, you got sidewalks? Deborah, y'all got sidewalks over in Foley? Some people. Wayne, raise your hand if you got sidewalks. Would y'all agree with me that sidewalks make the neighborhood a little bit better? All right, now let's talk about advocacy, right? Let's talk about advocacy, because some neighborhoods need sidewalks to make them feel neighborhoodly, right? And people always asking us, well, what can we do out there in Africatown? Well, I tell you what you can do, right? You can call 311, or you can write the city council, or you can write the mayor, you can write the city parents, and tell them you want sidewalks and lights in Africatown. That ain't, we can push a couple of keys on a keyboard and send that in no time at all on our phone. And so that being said, Nick, would you be so kind to define advocacy and the ways that your text is making a contribution to Africatown's advocacy as you see it?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I mean, of course I felt self-conscious about doing this as a white journalist. When I had the idea, so I first visited in 2018, met Joe, met some others, and wrote a piece about it for New York Magazine. I had spoken with Gary Lumbers, who I mentioned, to send it to Joe, and he said, you really need to be writing about the neighborhood. I was supposed to be writing about the descendants, and he said, you need to be writing about Plateau. So, then I had this idea of expanding the magazine piece into a book, but so I asked Joe, I asked Joycelyn, I asked others I had met, what would you think about me doing this? And the response I got almost universally was like, look, we need all the help we can get. So if you're going to do a responsible job of it, then we'd love to have you. And I guess implicit in that was the idea that was the sense that like telling a story would help. You know, that gathering all the documentation and then kind of broadcasting it to a bigger audience was going to help. And I mean, I think that there's been a gradual realization over the years that the history, the story, is the best asset that Africatown has. Henry Williams always said that, going back to the 50s, and you know, the world has kind of slowly come to agree with him. And from that perspective, I think that having it all in one place. You know, the book has like 70 pages worth of endnotes. My publisher was kind enough to let me use that many. I think that having it all in one place and having it all there in a I hope, readable format is part of that effort to use the story to save the neighborhood.
Let's give that man a hand again, y'all. All this work he did. Now, Joyce, I'm coming to you. Now, I want you to talk about IP. And I want you to talk about your granddaddy in IP. Because we talk about, you know, the descendants and all that all the time, every day. And you see, Joycelyn is now a mother of Africatown. Why? Because she's always found with the children. Doing what? Telling the story. And so, Joycelyn, if you would, tell us about IP and your granddaddy.
International Paper Company, my grandfather came to Mobile in the early 1940s from Decatur, Mississippi. They were very poor, they were farmers, but he came to Mobile for work. And International Paper Company was the place for him to work. And we thought that, of course, I was born later. My grandfather had a good job, okay? He was able to provide for his family. He had a boat, he had a truck, he had a car. We had property, what they call in the lane. We had property on Railroad Street and also on Newman's Lane. So he was able to do all of those things that he couldn't do in Decatur, Mississippi. So I never thought about International Paper Company as a bad place because my granddad worked there and he made a good, decent living. And I used to be excited to see him because he was able to walk to work. He could walk to work, and I remember seeing him coming home, and I would meet him halfway. He met my grandmother, who is a descendant, and he had a garden across from the railroad track. They lived on Railroad Street across from the railroad track. And even the railroad track. When you're growing up, you don't understand things. We lived across from a railroad track. We didn't know. I didn't know what was coming. What was coming across, what they were bringing in. We would wave and do our hand for the people to blow the horn, and they had the best blackberries on the railroad track. Gosh, I just remember that awful smell and the noise around noon. I don't know if it was lunchtime or what, but it was always a loud bell around 12 o'clock. But the smell was so awful. I remember, because I went to Mobile County Training School, it would, the ashes or the soot would fly over to the school. So I remember having a conversation not too long ago with someone, and I talked about how bad the smell was, and this guy said, you know what they said that smell was? And I was like, no, he said money. And that hit hard. Because that was the most awfulest smell. And just thinking about it, I can remember that smell. I can remember that smell, but my grandfather took great pride in working at International Paper Company. They had the best family picnics at the fairgrounds. We would go there, and you could take your car through this thing. They would rinse out the chemicals, but we thought it was fun to go through there, right? When you don't know, you don't know. But, International Paper Company had its pros and its cons. But, he and his brothers came from Decatur, Mississippi, thinking that, that was the best place for them to work.
Joe, that picture of Hog Bayou is still up there. Could you tell us about the hogs in Africatown and what y'all would do to them?
Besides eating them?
Well, you have that great story of the sort of the exchange between.
The old slave and the new slave. Hog Bayou is the area where, part of the area where International Paper set. And of course you had Scott Paper on the east side and International Paper on the north side. They're all in Africatown planted area. And they're all just right across the street from the residential area, from the houses. And that's one of the key there. The street was the only buffer. The street's on the ground. So there really is no buffer. You often hear words like footprint, but pollution has no footprint. When the wind blows, it goes where it goes. You heard Justin talk about the ash and the soot. And kids playing in it, And I can, as a kid, we all played. But then as I got older, I learned what the real story was. But as far as Hog Bayou is concerned, that's where International Paper Scott set just across the street from the community. But before they came here, before those industries came here, that was called the Happy Hunting Grounds. That was where the enslaved people fished and hunted and lived off the land. And once they became homeowners and started purchasing land, they never purchased any land over there because they didn't want to build over there. They didn't want to run the game further back into the woods. So it was like a game preserve for them. And it's called Hog Bayou because it had a bunch of animals over there. Hogs was one of them. And thus the word Hog Bayou. But the folklore Nick's talking about is one I tell all the time on the tours because it's a good example for me of why, how I call them the newer enslaved people, the ones off the Clotilda, taught the older enslaved people, the ones who were enslaved for generations, how to live off the land after slavery had ended. And it sort of goes like this. After they brought over the folks from the Clotilda, and the Mayer family got the 35 or 40 that they brought down here, they took them over to the overseer. And the overseer told them, say, okay, now y'all slaves, y'all gonna be slaves. So one of the older ones, we'll call him Joe, he said, wait a minute, what's this slave stuff? I've never been no slave. I've been free all my life. Well, what's this slave stuff? So the overseer looked out there we saw somebody about Joe's age, and we called him Jim. And he said, Jim, come here. Women enslaved people for years. He said, okay now, this is Jim. He's a good slave. Y'all follow him around, y'all do everything he does and do what he tell you, and y'all be just fine. So they followed him around all day, and they slaved like he told them. At the end of the day, Joe said, Jim, I don't like being no slave. You know, fun. They just want you to work. They don't want you to stop, they want to feed you. But it just ain't no fun, man. We gotta have some fun. He said, I'm sorry, but slave ain't no fun. He said, plus, you see that food over there? We gonna get all that if we slave. See that bathhouse? We allowed to use that. And you got to see that bunkhouse. And I'm married. I got a wife and kids, and so I got my separate quarters. I get all that for slavery. So okay, well, if we got a slave, we got a slave. So 5 years later, after the Civil War, they're all free. Overseer come back and say, okay, now y'all free, y'all gonna be free. Jim said, what's this, boss? What's this free stuff? I ain't never been free. I've been a slave all my life. My dad was a slave, his grandfather, everybody in my generation for years and years been slave. What's this free stuff? Joe said, don't worry about it, I got it. I got it. I take care of it. I teach him how to be free. So I know how to be free. I've only been slave for 5 years. I haven't forgotten how to be free. Just follow us. Jim said, well, how we gonna eat, man? They ain't gonna give us no free food. How we gonna eat? Joe said, over there, y'all got that place called Hog Bayou, don't you? He said, yeah. He said, y'all got deer over there. He said, yeah. He said, those deer think they're fast. Shoot, you let me get hungry. You can't outrun me. And when I was 12 years old, they gave me a spear and told me in Africa they kill a lion. That lion was trying to eat me, and I killed that lion. So y'all got deer. Y'all got hog. Y'all got coon. Y'all got possum. Y'all got squirrels. Y'all got birds. Y'all got fish. Y'all got everything over there y'all need to eat. And Jim said, yeah, Joe, but over there in the Hog Bayou, they got these great big old alligators. He said, yes, man, we gonna eat them suckers too. So that's to me one of the biggest folklores in Africatown, because that's what actually happened. Because once slavery ended, these slaves here in Africatown, they wanted their own land, so they started buying the land, they started forming a community. And so there were people that came from miles around and said, going down to Africatown, see what's going on. They established their own school, the only school in Mobile County, so you had to live near the school to go there, and plus industry began to open up years later, and so people came down. You heard Jocelyn talk about her grandfather came down to get work. And so they all followed the enslaved people that came above the Clotilda, who set the standards. They were there, and they taught the rest how to be free and how to take care of themselves.
All right. Joe, can I stay with you for a second? Can you tell us what kind of work you're doing with Safe Zone and what your organization is called?
Yeah, I have an organization called Jeff. I said, but we all work together in Africatown to make things get better. There are about 8 good nonprofits that are working and some that are still coming along. And CHESS is an environmental group. CHESS, C-H-E-S-S, stands for Clean, Healthy, Educated, Safe, and Sustainable Communities. And we work with all the nonprofits, especially the one, MEJAC, Mobile Environmental Justice Action Coalition. And we work to keep the community as clean and safe, free of pollution as we can. When the city was going through its reevaluation of the zoning ordinance, we worked with the city and pushed, especially when Councilman Carroll got in office, pushed for what we call now the safe zone. The safe zone is basically the residential areas of Africatown, and the idea that we want to keep them safe from industry, safe from pollution, as safe as possible from any extremely dangerous industry from coming in the area. Now, we grew up among industries. We grew up with factories right around the corner. And so the ones that are there, we're just asking them to be good stewards of the community, live by the rules, and ADM, EPA, and others to do their job and keep them clean. The newer ones, anything that we consider real hazardous to the community, we want to keep away from Africatown films, and when they try to bring tar sands to Africatown, we oppose that because that's not healthy for the community. And you won't want that in your backyard. And plus, with International Paper and Scott's being there for over 70-something years, this community had done their part. It's time to send that stuff somewhere else. This we've done our part.
Okay, going to Joycelyn, if you would, in the movie Descendant, you get to talk about or read from Barracoon. You got that wonderful scene under the Cochrane-Africatown Bridge, and you're reading about Cujo meeting with Timothy Mayer. And I want you to sort of talk about that moment in the film and what you have been thinking about it in the last year or so.
Well, I think I asked Nick about this question, and I'm always analyzing things because it says that Cujo was the spokesperson and he went to Timothy Mayer to ask, could they go back home? But my question was, they were enslaved by different people. Like my ancestor was enslaved by Colonel Thomas Buford, and others were enslaved by other people. So I just wanted to know, did Timothy Mayer have say-so in all the enslavers? Right? You had some that were Foster enslaved. So if Foster said, okay, you can go back, if Colonel Thomas Buford said you can go back, did Timothy Mayer have say-so in all of the others? That was my question. That's what I didn't understand.
Well, I think this conversation happened after the Civil War ended. I actually found an interview or one of these many journalist accounts where people visited Africatown in like 1890s, early 1900s, where this person, I don't see any reason to doubt the truth of the story. He says, because he spoke with the shipmates, he says they saved up money for months, and they actually went to Bill Foster and said, we want to pay you to take us back. And he was like, oh, that's like not nearly enough money. That's not, I'm sorry, but the scale of what it would cost for a voyage like that is not, what you've been able to save from your jobs at the sawmills and whatever. So it seems like it was probably after that they approached Tim Mayer and said, look, some of us work for you, but also you brought us here. And so you really, the least you could do is give us the land. So that was kind of plan B, I think.
Now, Dr. Mary Elizabeth, I don't know how much time we got, so I'm just going to do a few more. But it just strikes me to hear the three of y'all talk about the importance of storytelling and collective memory as a form of preservation. And I think sometimes when we gather about topics like this, things need said, right? Not just from a panelist point of view, but from folks who have the sensibility enough to show up on a Tuesday night at 6 p.m., right? Because we're preaching to the choir here. But I was just wondering, Nick, if you would say something more about what you have learned in the process of constructing this manuscript, what you have learned about ignored truths.
Yeah, I guess there is a lot to say about that. One theme that emerged here is that probably a lot of you have heard Darren Patterson talk about how when he was growing up, he didn't learn, he's a descendant, he didn't learn as a child about his heritage. He said, there was a sense among some people, and this is what Mama Eva speaks about too, that a sense of shame, of that association with West Africa and with slavery. It's hard to conceive of now because I think it just seems obvious to all of us that should be a source of pride. Those generations of struggle, but Mama Eva said that when she was in school, and so she was born in 1894, then this would have been right after 1900, she said that other kids in the school would say things like, "There go those little black Africans," and you know, she would cry. Kajo's children would fight. I think at least one of them ended up in prison, but the scholar Hannah Durkin, who has a book coming out next year on the shipmates, which is going to be really good, she found evidence that that one of his other sons also ended up in prison for assault. So my point is, there was this tendency to there was like a stigma associated with it, and I think that you know, people think of this story as one that was like suppressed and buried for years, but I mean, it was reported. The voyage of the ship was reported the day after it arrived in Mobile, and not just in the local paper, but this brief syndicated item that, like, thanks to you know, papers being digitized, I was able to find like dozens of examples of it appearing around the country. It ended up in the European press within a few days. I think Timothy Mayer probably tipped the paper off. There's no way of knowing for sure. I think he sort of wanted this both ways, like wanted to destroy the evidence so that he couldn't be prosecuted, but also wanted, it was an act of political protest to bring the ship over because he wanted to reopen the slave trade. So I think that he did want it to be known that he did it, he just didn't want it to be prosecutable. So it was known, and the story continued to be told by the criminals for decades. You know, Tim Mayer and Bill Foster both told the story in 1890. That was the year before Mayer died, and then I found later in my research, I found this clip in the civil rights paper, the Southern Courier, from two clips actually, 1967 and 1968, interviews with Augustine Mayer Jr., who was Timothy's grandson, where he's upset that they're installing plumbing and sewers and electricity in Africatown because his property is going to be assessed and he's going to have to, you know, pay extra taxes. And he says they don't need it. Like, essentially, like, those people are animals. They can just go back to, you know, to jungle life. I mean, my jaw dropped when I saw this. But he's posing in one of these clips next to in a photo. He poses next to a poster. It's like an advertisement for one of his grandfather's ships. It was called the Southern Republic. And so that's a reminder that the story was being told, just not being broadcast by the descendants of the shipmates. It was being broadcast by the white people. And then I think the 70s were kind of this watershed moment in American culture where, like, Alex Haley's Roots came out and the miniseries came out, and there was this big, like, African American genealogical craze, and there started to be a more widespread feeling that this was something to be proud of. And it seems to me, based on what I've been able to find, this is about the same time that the Mayer family kind of started to shy away from the public gaze, and the story started to be told more by the community itself, by the descendant community and the African community instead. There was there was this shift in the meaning of the story and a shift in, like, who derived power from it and what they thought they could achieve by telling it.
As we as an audience sort of bear witness to the truth behind our nation's history and contemplate what the future looks like, I want you to think about, we in a movie called Descendant, and we got a central character named Emmett Lewis in it. And Emmett Lewis Jr. has an Emmett Lewis III who's about 2.5 years old. And I got a son who's 10. Hell, I got a son who's 11 too, so a grandson who's 11 too, right? Joycelyn has niece and nephew. Joe has grandchildren. All y'all got grandchildren. I'm looking at young Carr here between mama and daddy Carr, right? And Joyce and I was wondering, that being said, if you would give the audience a charge, an audience, if you would hear the charge that Ms. Davis gives you and that you act on it.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact about the film Descendant. How many of you guys have seen the film Descendant? So there's a part in Descendant where Anderson Flynn is at the Equal Justice Initiative, and he said, he was watching the people going in and out, and he was like, it's not about, it's what you do when you leave, right? So just like here today, you know, what are you charged with when you leave here today? Because Africatown needs all of the above. Whatever you're thinking about, it needs, it's like when you take a test, A, B, C, D, all of the above. That's what Africatown needs. Simple things, street lights, we can, solar lights. I think someone asked, I was like, okay, can we have solar lights? Can we do things like that? Sidewalks, the school needs help. Litter, I'm working on a litter campaign. I say this all the time, but 60 of your students want to come and help for the litter campaign. Ransom Ministry is going to help with the litter campaign. There is so many things to be done. I actually text Mr. Patterson today at Mobile County Training School to ask, do the students know what's going on in Africatown? Do they know about the museum, the expedition is coming? Do they know about the potential movie studio? Do they know? That's always the thing in my mind. Do they know? How do we reach that next generation? Because they're next, right? To write these laws, we talked about that. They're the ones, young Carr, to write the laws. Because I know as a young person, you're thinking, not me. You are the future. You might not think it, but you are. So, you know, if you guys are charged with doing things, please visit descendantfilm.com. All four of the organizations on there, and you can choose which one you want to work with. There is the Descendants, Chess, MEJAC, and the Africatown Heritage Preservation Foundation. So that's your charge today.
Nick, can you give us a charge?
Oh, I mean, I think about how a story Joycelyn tells about how our mutual friend Mary Elliott from the Smithsonian asked her. I guess you were telling her about the work that Oriana, your cousin, has done to pass the story along, and she said, "Okay, what are you doing?" So, you know, I mean, take advantage of the resources that are available in local history. Well, also, not to draw this out, but I keep thinking about when the time 10 years ago when there was this effort to build a pipeline through the watershed and also to build oil tanks close to Africatown, and a lot of white people, like members of the Sierra Club who didn't have any dealings with Africatown before then, started going to meetings out there, and they said we didn't really even understand what it was, but then once we heard the story and learned about how the people had been treated, we all wanted to fight for Africatown. So I hope that will expand beyond that group and ripple out through all the people who saw the film and read the book.
Joe, give us a charge.
You know, over the years, I always sort of looked within myself to try to figure out the question why, you know, who am I? Why am I the way that I am? And being a military intelligence officer, an accountant, a leaper, those things sort of make me who I am. In other words, you're a very analytical person, you know, and I think about a lot of things. And I was told one time in the military, when you got a question of what to do or whatever, you always ask yourself, why? Why? Keep asking that question. And when you can, when you get to the point where you can't answer then you know why. But just keep asking the question. I always ask myself, well, I'll put it this way. I've lived in Mobile a long time, and I love Mobile. I love the people of Mobile. But I'm disappointed in Mobile. Why? Well, a lot of reasons. Mobile has not taken advantage of what it has to offer to the public, to the world. There's a lot of things. We ran out of water. We can't get there. I mean, Africa, that's one thing we've tried to do, we're still trying to do, get to a point where our kids are going back to the water. I enjoyed the water. I enjoyed the little things about the ditches that ran off the creeks and the rivers. And I used to enjoy playing with tadpoles and crawfish. But you know what? Those tadpoles and crawfish are not there anymore. Why? That's the very essence of life in the water. When your tadpoles and crawfish are not there, something's wrong. Well, where did they go? And so I don't have to talk a lot about Mobile. You know what I'm talking about. You know, we have some things that, other than Mardi Gras, but Mardi Gras is a big thing, and we take advantage of that. But there are other things that we take advantage of. We don't push. We have Senior Bowl that's doing great. But we also had the biggest music festival in the state for 20 years. It's gone. Why? I mean, I used to enjoy that. Kids enjoy that. Well, nothing wrong with it that I saw. But that's another thing. Cultural history, tourism is big. It was big before COVID. I think it's going to come back to be big. The city of Montgomery, off the, I still call it Lynch Museum, over the first 12 months, they had an increase in their tourism tax revenue of over $1 billion. And the people in the historical committee at Montgomery said we could do a better job because we've got the real story. The people are still, the descendants, the community. And then they found the ship. People asked me, what did I think about the ship? What did it do? I said, well, I think about those movies where I look and you see the gods playing chess, Zeus and Neptune and Venus, you know, they sit around playing chess. But Zeus never played fair because, you know, he can do anything he wants. And all of a sudden Zeus pulled out his back pocket. He told Tilda and sit down and said, okay, now what you gonna do with that? And things just took off from there. Mobile got a lot of stuff that it can do to bring more taxes into the city, and not having to tax the people. And we need to take advantage of those things. They're here because with tourism, we all got to work to make it work. They don't work by itself. Ain't gonna work on its own. And I think we all can do that because I think we all want it.
Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't do something. So we got some folks in here who need to be acknowledged. You know, and I don't know everybody in the room, but I know most of y'all. Bobby and Pat, y'all stand up as descendants. Any other descendants in the room? All right. Pat and Bobby, y'all stay standing. Bob, stay standing. Mr. Adams, the Adamses, will y'all stand? Y'all from Plateau, the Adams family there, y'all stand up. They from Plateau. Hold on.
I grew up across the street from Nelson Adams, and I just remember that they did a lot of stuff for the community. He bought a lot of property, had a lot of rental homes, and over the years, I don't remember him ever putting anybody out of his house. Just putting on paper.
And in keeping with our theme of advocacy, if you ever done any work, Vicki and Deborah and Phil and Dr. Yamanku, if you ever done any work in Africatown, or if you live in Africatown, go ahead and stand up right now. Wayne, come on now, stand up. Deborah. Vicki, stand up. Where Miss Lovegood? Where you at, Miss Lovegood? There she go. There go our commissioner back there. This concludes our program. I want to thank y'all for coming. What you want now? Come on up here, man. Come on up here. You're going to tell us your name, and you're going to take us out with a prayer, okay? Oh, okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Washington T. Taylor. Everybody who grew up in Plateau know me as Wash Taylor. I finished the Mobile County Training School in 1949, and I see a couple other people who went to school when I was out there. But the main thing I want to say is that Mobile County Training School was a school among schools. Everybody was proud to attend Mobile County Training School. They would elect to attend it over other schools. And of course, at that time, you know, there was segregation, so that we went to county. But you didn't have but two schools. You had county, and you had Dunbar, and then after Dunbar, you had Central. But county was the school that everybody wanted to attend, or most people did. In fact, this young man had a grandmother, Mrs. Lang, who attended, and not attended, but who taught school at Mobile County Training School. In fact, she taught me. And at this time, I would just like to say that we thank all of you for coming, and we would like to offer a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for those who came here. We hope that they will be motivated by what they've seen and what they've heard. Dear Heavenly Father, we ask that you be with them, give them a safe journey back to their home. These and other blessings we ask in thy Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, that's it. Let's go to work.
Again, thank you all for being here, and a couple of things that are really important for you to know. The Spirits of the Passage, the story of the transatlantic slave trade exhibition, is here through June 21st, the museum just to the left of here, and it is here because Commissioner Ludgood answered immediately when I said, I have this opportunity, but I don't have the money. So thank Commissioner Ludgood. And the Mobile County Marketing Fund gave us the funds to promote, to have the banners, the posters, the radio spots, and so forth. So I am incredibly grateful, all of the staff are, for the people who have made it possible to have an event that brings you all here. And thank you very much. Thank all of you.